He died broke at 57 while his discovery became a millionaire. For decades, millions believed Harold Melvin was the voice behind If You Don't Know Me By Now, but they were dead wrong. This is the story of the man who built an empire, lost everything to his own creation, and watched from the shadows as others got rich off his genius. The twisted tale of Harold Melvin proves that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is put your name on something and hand the microphone to someone else. Picture this. You're at a party in 1973, and that smooth, soulful voice comes through the speakers singing, If You Don't Know Me By Now. Someone asks, who's singing? And without hesitation, you say Harold Melvin. After all, it's Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, right? Wrong. That voice belonged to a 23-year-old former drummer named Teddy Pendergrass, and this confusion would haunt Harold for the rest of his life. Harold made a branding decision that seemed brilliant at the time. In 1970, when he restructured his group, he put his name front and center, Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes. He wanted the world to know who was in charge, who had built this machine from nothing. But when Teddy stepped up to that microphone, something magical happened that Harold never anticipated. The voice was so powerful, so commanding, that audiences assumed Harold Melvin was the man singing. Night after night, concert after concert, Harold would watch from the sidelines as crowds screamed for Teddy, thinking they were screaming for him. The cruel irony? Harold's decision to put his name first had backfired spectacularly. Instead of cementing his legacy, it created the biggest case of mistaken identity in soul music history. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button because this story gets wilder. The confusion wasn't just among casual fans. Music journalists, radio DJs, and even industry insiders regularly mixed up the two. Harold would do interviews where reporters asked him about his incredible voice, referring to Teddy's vocals. He'd smile, nod, and play along because what else could he do? Correcting everyone would only highlight how little the public knew about him, the actual Harold Melvin. This wasn't just about ego, this was about legacy, about credit, about being remembered. Harold had spent nearly 2 decades building the Blue Notes from street corners to the charts, but in the public's mind, he was the voice they heard on the radio. When that voice eventually walked away, Harold discovered the terrible truth. He'd built a brand around someone else's talent. 1970 was supposed to be just another year of grinding for Harold and the Blue Notes. They'd been hustling for over 15 years, switching lineups, changing labels, chasing that elusive breakthrough. Then fate walked in wearing the uniform of the Cadillac's backing band. Theodore Pendergrass was 20 years old, cocky as hell, and played drums like his life depended on it. Harold needed a drummer, nothing more. But during rehearsal, something happened that would change the trajectory of American soul music forever. Teddy started humming along to one of their songs. Then he started singing harmony. Then he opened his mouth and let loose with that voice, that raw, thunderous, heart-stopping baritone that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the earth. Harold stopped cold. In that moment, he heard dollar signs, chart positions, and the sound of everything he'd been working toward finally clicking into place. He made a decision that would make him rich, famous, and ultimately destroy him. He handed Teddy the microphone. The transformation was immediate and undeniable. The Blue Notes went from being another Philadelphia group grinding it out in clubs to the hottest soul act on the East Coast. Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff, the masterminds behind Philadelphia International Records, came calling. They heard Teddy's voice and saw gold records. They offered Harold and the Blue Notes a deal that would change their lives forever. But here's what Harold didn't see coming. Once you give someone that kind of power, that kind of spotlight, it's almost impossible to take it back. Teddy wasn't just singing the songs, he was becoming the songs. His voice, his presence, his magnetic stage persona were turning him into a star, and stars have a way of outgrowing their creators. By 1972, when If You Don't Know Me By Now hit #1 on the R&B charts and cracked the top 3 on the pop charts, the die was cast. The public had their star, and it wasn't Harold Melvin. It was the man Harold had discovered, molded, and put front and center. The man who was about to realize he didn't need Harold anymore. From the outside, 1972 to 1976 looked like pure magic. Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes were dominating radio, selling out venues and becoming the face of Philadelphia soul. The Love I Lost practically invented disco. Wake Up Everybody became a social anthem. They were riding high on a wave of success that most groups could only dream of. But behind the velvet curtains and sold-out signs, a different story was playing out. Harold was still running the business side, controlling the finances, making the decisions. After all, it was his group, his name on the marquee, his 2 decades of grinding that had built this platform. The money flowed through him, and he distributed it as he saw fit. Teddy was getting paid, sure, but not like a star, not like the voice that was moving millions of records and packing arenas. Harold saw it as simple mathematics. He'd built the machine. Teddy was just the most important part. But Teddy was starting to do his own math, and the numbers weren't adding up. The tension was palpable during recording sessions and rehearsals. Teddy would suggest changes to arrangements, only to have Harold shut him down. Harold would make business decisions without consulting Teddy, even though Teddy's voice was the reason those decisions mattered. The group was becoming a pressure cooker, and everybody in Philly could feel the steam building. If you're enjoying this deep dive into music history, make sure to hit that like button and let us know in the comments. Things got worse when Philadelphia International Records started pushing for more Teddy-centric marketing. Album covers featured his image more prominently. Interview requests came specifically for him. The label executives were smart enough to see where the real star power was, and it wasn't with the man whose name was on the group. Harold watched all of this happening and felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. He'd created a star, but that star was now threatening to eclipse everything he'd built. The golden years were becoming a golden prison, with Harold holding the keys to a cell that was starting to feel too small for both him and his creation. By 1975, the situation had reached a breaking point. Teddy Pendergrass was no longer just the lead singer of Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes. He was a certified sex symbol, a superstar, and he knew it. The crowds weren't chanting Harold's name, they were chanting his. The fan mail wasn't addressed to the group leader, it was addressed to him. And the money? Well, that was still flowing through Harold. The confrontation that would end everything started over something that sounds almost petty now: billing. Teddy wanted the group renamed Teddy Pendergrass and the Blue Notes. He wanted his name first, wanted the recognition that matched his contribution. Harold's response was swift and final. Absolutely not. This was his group, his creation, his legacy. But this wasn't really about billing. This was about money, respect, and power. Industry insiders whisper about numbers that would make your head spin. Some say Teddy was asking for a 50-50 split of everything. Others claim he wanted his own separate contract with Philadelphia International Records. The exact figures remain disputed, but what's clear is that millions of dollars were on the table. The argument that ended it all allegedly happened in 1976, backstage at a venue whose name has been lost to time. By all accounts, it was explosive. Harold refused to renegotiate. Teddy refused to stay. Philadelphia International Records, faced with choosing between the established leader and the rising star, made a decision that would echo through music history. Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff had heard the arguments, seen the tension, and done the math. Teddy Pendergrass could sell records as a solo artist. Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes without Teddy Pendergrass would be just another oldies act. From a business perspective, it was a no-brainer. When Teddy walked away from the Blue Notes in 1976, he wasn't just leaving a group, he was taking the heart, the voice, and the commercial appeal that had made them stars. Harold was left holding a name, a legacy, and a group of talented musicians who suddenly felt very, very quiet. The departure of Teddy Pendergrass from Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes wasn't just a personnel change. It was like removing the engine from a Rolls-Royce and expecting it to keep running. Harold knew he needed to replace the irreplaceable, but how do you replace lightning? David Ebo was Harold's first attempt at recapturing the magic. He had a decent voice, could hit the notes, and looked good on stage. But comparing David Ebo to Teddy Pendergrass was like comparing a candle to a bonfire. The Blue Notes released Reaching for the World in 1977, and while it hit the R&B top 10, everybody knew it was a shadow of what they'd once been. Harold refused to give up. He'd survived 2 decades of rejection and rebuilding before Teddy came along. He could survive this too, but the music industry is a cruel mistress, and by the late 1970s, she was already moving on to the next sound, the next star, the next sensation. The venues got smaller, the crowds got thinner, the record deals got worse. ABC Records gave them a shot, then MCA Records, then smaller labels that most people had never heard of. Each new contract felt like a step down from where they'd been, a reminder of how far they'd fallen. Meanwhile, Teddy Pendergrass was becoming everything Harold had feared and dreaded. His solo albums were going platinum. His concerts were selling out arenas. His face was on magazine covers. He was the sex symbol of soul music, and he was doing it all without Harold's name attached to it. But Harold kept grinding. He brought in new singers like Gil Saunders, who had real talent, and helped the group find some success in the UK. They recorded albums that showcased their continued musical abilities, but the harsh reality was that most people had moved on. The Blue Notes were now an oldies act, trading on past glories while their former lead singer dominated contemporary R&B. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into music history. By the 1980s, Harold was playing smaller venues, sometimes in front of crowds who didn't even realize they were seeing the original founder of the group. The man who had discovered Teddy Pendergrass, who had built the Blue Notes from nothing, was now performing in clubs where people requested songs that another man had made famous with his voice. The cruelest irony of Harold Melvin's later years wasn't just that he was struggling financially while his former protege thrived. It was that his music was about to become more valuable than ever, just as he became too weak to capitalize on it. In 1996, Harold suffered a massive stroke that left him paralyzed on his right side and unable to speak clearly. The man who had spent his life talking, negotiating, leading, and organizing was suddenly silenced. He spent his final months at home in Philadelphia, listening to old Blue Notes records and watching television appearances from their glory days. His wife, Ovelia, would later tell reporters that Harold spent those final weeks enjoying tapes of his old hits. There's something heartbreaking about that image. The forgotten genius of Philadelphia soul, paralyzed and voiceless, listening to the empire he'd built and lost. Harold Melvin died on March 24, 1997, at the age of 57. The news barely made national headlines. There were no tribute concerts, no televised memorials, no industry-wide moments of silence, just a few paragraphs in music trade publications and local Philadelphia papers, noting the passing of a man who had helped define an entire genre of music. But here's where the story gets really twisted. Just as Harold was fading from public memory, hip-hop producers were digging through crates of old soul records, looking for samples to build the next generation of hits. And what did they find? Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes gold mines. The irony is staggering. Jay-Z built This Can't Be Life around a sample of I Miss You. Kanye West flipped Blue Notes tracks into chart toppers. DJ Premier, Dr. Dre, and countless other producers discovered that Harold's old recordings were perfect foundation stones for hip-hop's greatest hits. These samples generated millions of dollars in publishing revenue, radio play, and album sales. The music Harold had recorded in the 1970s was suddenly more commercially relevant than it had been in decades. But Harold wasn't alive to see any of it, wasn't around to collect any of those checks, wasn't there to finally get the recognition he deserved. The man who had been forgotten by his own industry was unknowingly becoming one of the most sampled artists in hip-hop history. His fingerprints were all over the sound of the 1990s and 2000s, but his name was buried in the liner notes if it was mentioned at all. What do we owe Harold Melvin? That's the question that haunts anyone who digs deep enough into his story. He wasn't the voice that made the hits, wasn't the face that sold the records, wasn't the star that packed the arenas. But he was the architect, the discoverer, the builder who made it all possible. Harold Melvin's story is the story of every unsung hero in the music industry. The A&R executives who discover superstars and get fired when those stars demand creative control. The producers who craft hit sounds and watch artists take all the credit. The songwriters who pen classics and see performers become millionaires while they struggle to pay rent. He made a choice that millions of creative people face. Do you stay in the background and maintain control, or do you step into the spotlight and risk losing everything? Harold chose control, put his name on the group, kept his hands on the business, and in doing so, he created the very conditions that would eventually destroy him. The music industry loves a simple narrative. It wants clear heroes and villains, obvious stars and forgotten footnotes. Harold Melvin doesn't fit neatly into any of those categories. He was a genius and a control freak, a discoverer and a victim of his own success, a builder who got crushed by his own creation. Today, Harold Melvin's Blue Notes still tour, managed by his widow Ovalia, performing the hits that made them famous decades ago. New generations of fans discover If You Don't Know Me By Now and assume they're hearing the voice of Harold Melvin. The confusion that plagued him in life continues to define him in death. But maybe that's fitting. Maybe Harold Melvin's true legacy isn't in the spotlight or the record sales or the recognition he never received. Maybe it's in the music itself, in the songs that continue to move people, in the sound that influenced generations of artists, in the proof that sometimes the most important person in the room is the one you never see. What's your favorite Harold Melvin and the Blue Note song? Drop it in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button if this story opened your eyes to the man behind the music. Subscribe for more untold stories of the legends who built the soundtrack to our lives, and remember, every star needs someone to build their stage. Because in the end, Harold Melvin didn't just discover Teddy Pendergrass. He discovered that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is create something bigger than yourself and expect to control it forever. His story is a reminder that in the music industry, as in life, the builders rarely get to live in the houses they construct.